Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 Southwest Florida Climate Summit. We are now going into panel 3. We're going to dive right in. This panel is covering the policy and legal framework for climate action. Our presenters today are Elizabeth Gore from Environmental Defense Fund, Whitney Gray from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and Erin Deady from Erin Deady Law, followed again by a Minty audience question and answer period with our panel presenters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Gore.
Well, thank you. I am going to be talking about climate policy in Washington, D.C. I'm going to be covering the activity at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. First, I'll talk about what's happening with the administration, including international activity and administrative actions. And then secondly, I'll discuss what's happening around climate on Capitol Hill and the legislative opportunities that I see to make progress. So let's start with the Biden administration. To begin, let's focus on the all of government approach that Joe Biden has embraced around climate change. And for groups like mine that focus on climate, this has been a breath of fresh air for us and reflects the idea that climate policy should not be siloed off as a standalone issue, but should be incorporated into all policy areas because climate change impacts everything. Gina McCarthy, a familiar name and a familiar face to many of us, is the domestic climate coordinator in the White House. And she has assembled an impressive staff, and she is the orchestra conductor on all things climate across all of the different agencies. She's got a huge task ahead of her, and but she's a veteran, and she's using all of the tools and the levers across all of government. You know, they say that personnel is policy, and if that's the case, Gina is just one example of the climate experts throughout the Biden administration. It's been remarkable, really, to see the bench of climate hawks throughout the White House and the agencies too. Michael Regan at EPA, Gina McCarthy, John Kerry, Jennifer Granholm at DOE, and even less familiar names like Brian Deese and Ron Klain are notable because they're high-ranking White House staffers with deep background on climate policy. And this all-star lineup of climate experts really signals the commitment of the president to make progress here. Now, a big part of implementing a pro-climate agenda is administrative action. And in some ways, this is the most important and the most overwhelming task that Biden is facing. From perspectives from environmentalists like me, so much damage was done during the Trump administration, and we lost precious time in our fight against the changing climate. So the Biden administration has clearly committed to reversing some of the rollbacks that we saw over the last 4 years, and then leapfrogging to a new set of standards to end pollution from vehicles, power plants, and oil and gas fields. So our goal as an environmental organization is to keep the pressure on for that ambition and to keep pushing for prompt and bold action. And then finally with the administration, let me touch on the international space. Obviously, the president rejoined the Paris Accords on the very first day of the administration. Now, in some ways, this is a symbolic step, but it also provides a path forward for renewed American leadership in the climate arena. One of the key steps of rejoining Paris is to lay out a national goal for emissions reductions. And so the administration announced on Earth Day a target of at least 50% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030. And that was great news for our planet. It's ambitious but achievable, and it's also what science demands and what the economy needs. By making a strong shift now to a clean energy economy, we can ensure that the new jobs to support that transition stay here in the United States. So it's hard to overstate the importance of the United States putting out a bold goal, which really goes a long way to establishing or reestablishing climate leadership on the world stage. But of course, the administration is not the only hive of activity these days. So let me move 2 miles east to Capitol Hill and talk about what's happening in the House and in the Senate. Let me start with a little color commentary. So many people and interest groups and trade associations and nonprofits saw the new administration and the Democratic majority Congress as a path towards transformative progressive policies. Now, this wasn't just in the area of climate change, but also labor standards and minimum wage, immigration, DC statehood, healthcare, childcare, and higher education reform, but not so fast. The narrowest margins in the House in 3 generations makes Nancy Pelosi's job extremely challenging. And you cannot get any closer than the 50-50 split in the Senate. So that means that while Democrats may seem to be well positioned to advance lots of big priorities, it's the moderates on both sides of Capitol Hill in the House and the Senate who wield enormous power and have acted as a check on the wish list of progressives. Now, much has been said and written about the role that Joe Manchin, a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, the role he plays in shaping what Democrats can get passed. And for all of the hyperbole around his influence, it is still understated. He is one of the fulcrum, one of the real focal points of figuring out how we're going to advance a congressional agenda. Now, one other thing, while talking about process is maybe not so interesting for everybody, I love it. But I'll try not to torture you all by diving too far in the weeds. But I do want to make a few points about process in the United States Senate, because it does influence the trajectory of climate policy in Washington. So number 1, you need 60 votes, a supermajority, to move anything through regular order in the United States Senate due to the dreaded filibuster. 2, there are parliamentary tools that can reduce that threshold down to 50, and the Senate has already deployed them for that COVID relief bill that passed in March. But there are limits to what can be done this way. You might remember that the House included a minimum wage increase in the COVID relief bill, but that provision got stripped out in the Senate because of this funky procedure that they were using to get it down to a 50 vote threshold. 3, there's been lots of discussion about doing away with the filibuster altogether. But as of now, Democrats are not in agreement about whether this is a good idea. We've already talked about Joe Manchin, and he doesn't support eliminating the filibuster. And without him, Senate Majority Chuck Schumer doesn't have the votes to eliminate the filibuster and can't make that change. So there's lots of drama around all of this. And if anybody here wants to grab a few beers and talk Senate procedure, send me an email and we'll go down the rabbit hole. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, back to the topic of hand around legislation. Here are some of the big climate related items that we're focused on and that have some momentum in Congress. First, transportation electrification. This means not just cars, but buses and trucks too. And this will be really around providing incentives for manufacturing of vehicles, but also component parts, charging stations, and batteries. This is a jobs issue. It's an economic stimulus issue. It's an emissions reduction issue, and it also has an environmental justice component. So this is a good example of the effort to embed climate in other policy debates. Instead of trying to move a straight up siloed climate bill, it looks to integrate reductions in emissions in every legislative vehicle. So transportation and infrastructure are also good places to build some bipartisanship, even in these very polarized days. So look for this to move early, probably this month through the committee anyway, and hopefully gain support from both sides of the aisle. I would note that last year under Republican leadership, the Senate Environment Committee developed a bill that had a $10 billion climate. So this is a committee that covers environment and transportation. And this bill was supported unanimously by both Democrats and Republicans in that committee. Now that Democrats have the pen, we're looking to grow that number for climate investments, as well as keep this commitment to trying to have broad political support. There's also an effort to expand that transportation and infrastructure package to encompass other policies more broadly, like grid modernization and broadband and a whole list of other investments. The path forward on that is a little more murky, but so our strategy has been to focus squarely on transportation electrification. Okay, a second policy I'd like to highlight is the natural climate solutions. EDF and other stakeholders have had good success in pushing forward some of these solutions, although everybody has a little bit of a different definitions about what it means. For us, it means policies like sustainable agriculture and bolstering natural carbon sinks like trees, forestry provisions. These policies get support from rural communities that have traditionally been a little more skeptical on climate action. And they also help to bring big agriculture interests to the table as allies instead of adversaries. Another natural solution that's gaining ground and that has impact in Florida is expanding opportunities for so-called blue carbon along our coastlines and also out in deep water. The next area I want to focus on is innovation. Innovation is going to be a critical part of the path forward toward reducing emissions on the scale that we need. Both the Biden administration and Congress have focused on investments in R&D to ensure that the next generation of climate-friendly technology is coming online. So innovation is not enough in and of itself, but it's part of the solution for long-term success. And then lastly, power sector decarbonization. There's been chatter around a potential clean energy standard for the power sector. The Biden administration has mentioned it in its infrastructure rollout, and some utilities have expressed support for CES. Climate leaders on Capitol Hill have started to discuss it. So it's certainly an area of interest on the Hill, but I have to say, I don't see this as a 2021 issue. It's really challenging, it's really complicated. And so I think the activity now is setting the table for legislation down the road. And then lastly, one more topic I want to just touch on, and that's environmental justice. Environmental justice is a growing force within the environmental movement and also within the Democratic Party. So the good news is that these communities that have been sidelined and overlooked for a long time have found new voice that is both influential and strong. Legislation on Capitol Hill will not pass without EJ provisions that recognize and address issues like disproportionate impact of pollution on communities of color. And both the White House and the Congress will oppose proposals that don't require pollution reduction in these frontline communities. And there's a growing effort to ensure that funding that's invested in clean energy and climate infrastructure, it's targeted in a way that allows EJ communities to join the energy transformation. So that's it. That's the view from inside the Beltway. For those of you who may have stepped out or dozed off, here's my Cliff Notes version. The administration is taking a whole of government approach. It has a huge regulatory agenda, and it's also re-engaging on the international scene with new commitments and partnerships. And on Capitol Hill, Congress is working on climate-friendly legislation in a number of areas, including transportation electrification, natural climate solutions, and innovation. A clean energy standard to push the power sector to clean generation is just starting to get attention. And finally, Environmental justice is a growing part of these conversations and will be critical to finding success in advancing climate policy. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. We'll now be going on to Whitney Gray.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be and honored to be in this side by side with all these amazing people and the rest of this program. It's also super fun for me to be back here because I've really got my start in Southwest Florida, coming from the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council. And it's really so gratifying to see the progress that the area has made over the years. And I'm excited to be here and involved and to do whatever I can to help continue that progress. Next slide. I want to start by just talking a little bit about the program that I work with in DEP. We are called the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program, and the program was started in late 2017 to really work closely with coastal local governments and to help them with these incredible issues that they were facing around sea level rise and increased erosion and flooding and those kinds of issues. So we built this program, and really there's kind of three legs to the stool. We reach out to local governments with resources, technical resources like the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook. We, of course, have resilience planning grants and implementation grants. That's everybody's favorite part. And we also do a lot of coordination. So in addition to other things, we have a quarterly webinar called the Coastal Resilience Forum. Just had one yesterday, actually. So the next one is in August, but I encourage everybody who's not involved to take a look at our website and see how you can sign up to get on that 2-hour webinar once a quarter. Really, we provide a lot of what's happened over the couple of years that we've been doing this is that we've developed really kind of a community of practice across the state. We have we're getting up to 150, 175 people on these calls, which is great, but really there's good exchange of ideas and a lot of other support really that goes on between practitioners. So it's really gratifying to see all that come together and to see all these practitioners, resilience practitioners around the state get in touch with more resources that they need on a regular basis. What we've been able to, next slide, please. What we've been able to accomplish is pretty cool. So just since early 2018, we've awarded grants to 129 cities and counties. You can see their distribution around the state there. We've been able to grant about $6.5 million, and the vast majority of those are planning projects, as you can see. The planning projects include dealing with some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself about Peril of Flood and those kinds of things. But I feel like we've really had a good impact. And as I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, this has really, we realized how this has just scratched the surface. And what's really exciting is what's coming. As Secretary Ballenstein mentioned earlier, what's coming next is really, really big, and we're excited to do that. But let me go back in time a little bit. That's sort of a little bit about us, but let me go back and talk a little bit about how we got where we are, because what I'm supposed to talk about today is kind of the policy background of resilience in the state. And you can go to the next slide, please. And this slide is really interesting to me. I put this together. This is a graphic from our Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook. And because the guidebook came out of a particular project, it focused on certain policy aspects, but I want to mention a couple of things that aren't on this timeline that really should be mentioned. Because if you go back to 2009, you can see that first bullet there talks about the Southeast Florida Climate Compact and their first summit and so forth. But at around the same time, due in large part to CHNEP's activities and using the EPA's Climate Ready Estuaries grants, there were projects done in Southwest Florida that really, in some cases, predated some of that stuff on the East Coast. So I was very excited to be involved with the Punta Gorda vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. That really, the timeline is a little fuzzy right in there, who came first. But it was a great project to work on and resulted in comprehensive plan amendments that really set some groundbreaking policy in the city of Punta Gorda. Lee County at that time also did, using the same kind of funding, we did a vulnerability assessment for them and an adaptation strategy or resilience strategy. So just so that you all know, I want to just make sure that we acknowledge the great work that's gone on in Southwest Florida over the years. You can see a lot of the different milestones that have been hit down the years since then. Southeast Florida definitely has been a huge influence on this sector in many, many ways. In 2011, we'll talk as we go along about adaptation action areas. In 2015, we get to the Peril of Flood statute. In between there, we have a lot of activity here at DEP under the Florida Coastal Management Program that's funded by NOAA to fill in those gaps and help provide a lot of foundation. So there has been, might not always make the news, but there has been a lot of activity going on that has helped to improve resilience in coastal Florida communities. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that happened was the creation of adaptation action areas, the statute that led to that. So this is an adaptation action area identifies one or more areas that experience coastal flooding due to extreme high tides and storm surge, and that are vulnerable to related impacts of rising sea level. And it's an optional designation. This was passed back in 2011. It went into the statutes, and it gives coastal communities the option of creating a designation. You can, when you look at it on a map, it's basically drawing a line around a vulnerable area to target that area for improvements that would help mitigate flood damage and perhaps erosion as well. Interestingly, the way that this came about is there was some thought that when the concept was brought up, that this would be a tool that could be used to then leverage funding at a higher level, I believe on the federal level. So there was some notion that we could create this statute, this designation, and it would enable those communities that used it to identify more federal funding and to get an advantage, to get some more federal funding. That didn't happen, but it has happened on a state basis, because in our grant program in Florida Resilient Coastlines program, creating an adaptation action area or doing an implementation project in an adaptation action area actually is an advantage in that competitive grant process. So we have tried to learn as we go along and build that functionality in, and I think it's working. We see lots of different areas taking on this adaptation action area strategy, and it helps them focus their work, and it helps us focus how we can best address the funding needs in those areas. Next slide, please. Another key piece of legislation that passed in 2015 was the Peril of Flood statute. And I always have to be really careful when I say that. I'm glad it's on a slide in front of you, because people have asked me before, what is parallel flood? Well, it's Peril of Flood. That's a name taken from the statute, the title of the statute. And it's just so dramatic, it's caught on. So how exciting is that? But Peril of Flood actually took the whole concept of resilience to the next level. And it actually helped to, it's not an optional thing for coastal communities. It is a requirement for coastal communities to comply with the requirements in this statute. And you can see that it's includes sea level rise as one of the causes of flood risk that must be addressed in the redevelopment principles and strategies and engineering solutions. And there are 6 aspects to it that are required. And DEO, of course, has the jurisdiction over this, which is great. And they're doing an amazing job of helping coastal communities get through this. A lot of our grants, our planning grants, have been focused on peril of flood. We saw this when we started this program as kind of a foot in the door to start the resilience conversation in places where it hadn't started yet. And then to be able to back that up with grant dollars to help those communities get into compliance, that just, sort of completed the package there. Right now, they're about half, a little more than half of the required cities and counties have completed these peril of flood requirements according to DEO. Our program has funded about 1/3 of those that have completed it. We're looking forward to doing a lot more in that regard. And we have plenty of funding now to help coastal communities with those kinds of projects. We're very excited about this, and it's really takes it to the fundamental policy level within each local community. Next slide, please. So this slide, possibly a little bit out of order, just talks a little bit about what the role that NOAA has played all along, and really what gave rise to the Florida Resilient Coastlines program. Because starting back in 2011, this community resilience initiative was developed as a coastal management program strategy. And the strategy lasted a number of years and really gave rise to not just FRCP, but several other things. And it's really has laid the foundation. We still have resilience goals and strategies within the coastal management program in Florida. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Joe Bauer, is available to come and do in person or online trainings with local communities to show them how to use some of the really amazing decision support tools that are free and publicly available, many of them through NOAA's Digital Coast. So we continue that relationship, that close tie and coordination with the Florida Coastal Management Program, because there's just all hands on deck as far as we're concerned at DEP. Next slide. So those things kind of are back in the now distant past of 2011 and 2015. And so what's happened more recently than that? You may be aware that last year in the 2020 session, a statute was passed that what was the title of it had to do with an act relating to public financing of coastal construction projects. So when that statute passed, it set a timetable for rulemaking, which we have jumped into right away. But this is really groundbreaking legislation for the state. If you go back to the 2011 Adaptation Action Area, you see the term sea level rise in Florida statutes really for the first time. The sea level impact projection studies 161.551 is just amping it up to the next level again. So the whole point of this statute is to require, really, if you get right down to it, the wise spending of state dollars. And so what it requires is for coastal construction, certain coastal construction that's funded by the state or with pass-through dollars from the federal government through the state to go through a sea level impact projection study. Our task was to put that all into rule. Sounds very easy from that title, but we were required to translate that into a rule to actually be able to administer it. Next slide, please. So here's the timeline that we've been following. We are now, you can see that we did quite a bit of roundtable discussions. We got a lot of input from stakeholders that would likely be using the rule. And we decided pretty early on that probably the best way to make sure that we got consistent slip studies and made these analyses consistent with each other is we designed an easy button. The easy button is the slip study tool. It does not have a swift, catchy name, but maybe we'll get there by the time we launch. we're hoping to launch that tool on July 1st. And what we've done is develop an online mapping tool with the help of our partners at Taylor Engineering. And this is a great example of how you can really leverage the work that's going on in other parts of the state. We looked at a tool that had been developed for the Northeast Regional Council in Jacksonville to highlight flooding risks and sea level rise risks basically in the Jacksonville area. And we thought, this is the kind of tool that we wanted to create to help form the platform for our slip study tool. So Taylor came in and we've been working on that tool since then. We have, as I mentioned, had a number of workshops to get input from the stakeholders on how this tool could best help them and how what are the main concerns and how we could address those. We have at the same time been developing the rule language. If you want to go to the next slide, you can see the actual rule. So the rule what we tried to do with the rule was to make the narrative analog to what the tool was doing. So the online tool, like I kind of jokingly called it the easy button, but it truly is. I'll show you some screenshots in a minute. It makes doing the slip study really easy. The slip study is a non-regulatory informational tool. What we want is for folks getting ready to build something with state dollars to take a look at how sea level rise might affect that structure. And so we're not telling you how to build your thing. We just want you to take a look at the options that may be available to you. So the tool actually incorporates a lot of adaptation possibilities and stuff like that. The rule needed to provide how we did this. Because you're not required to use the tool, you can certainly do a manual, if you will, slip study. We wanted to make it very clear how to go about doing that. And we did that so that any manually done slip studies would be consistent, and we have a big basket of apples instead of apples and oranges or grizzly bears in our basket. So you can see here, this is some of the basic requirements of the slip study. The state finance constructor has to do these things before they begin construction, and they have to do them at least 30 days before construction commences. And of course, we actually emphasize in the rule that it's very important to try and do it much earlier than 30 days prior to commencement. Most projects really need to have it done way before that. But we were dealing with what we were allowed to make a rule about in terms of what the statute allowed us to do. So we did have some sideboards there that we had to stay within. So you have to do the study, you have to submit the study, and then the study will stay on the website for 10 years available to the public. Next slide, please. I'll touch now the fun part. I've got some screenshots here from the tool. We're really excited about this. This is the basic interface, or the landing page or splash page, whatever you call it. This is where you start. And you can see, it's not showing on this view, but there are also buttons that will go below that title there that aim the user, the public user, or the slip study user at lots of other resources too. So we have resources on the tool that will show lots of different adaptation options, kind of an adaptation library, if you will. We'll also have information generally about climate change and sea level rise in Florida, and how sea level rise is affecting Florida. And then of course there's this whole area where you can go directly to just do your slip study if you need to do that. Next slide, please. So here's a screenshot of that beginning that work. If you were going to look down at, you can use this tool in two different ways. You can do it primarily just to do your slip study, but a member of the public can use it, anybody can use it, just to look at how sea level rise might affect their neighborhood, their house, their town, whatever you like. So it works in that regard a lot like other sea level rise viewers. You can see here that we've got, these are all the different layers over on the left under coastal flooding. You can see the different layers that are brought into the tool. The tool does an amazing job of bringing in layers from other tools. So there's not a lot of this data that's like super resident in our tool, which would slow it down and make it kind of cumbersome and require lots of updates. What we do is leverage that information from NOAA, from FEMA, to and then when they update theirs, our information is just automatically updated when it's brought in. It's pretty ingenious, and I think that'll make it a really useful tool going forward. But you can see here how it looks like a lot of other sea level rise viewers, in that you can adjust all your different, you can set it for different regional scenarios and different levels of sea level rise, just to see how it affects your location. Next slide, please. But if you need to do the slip study for real, then you can click on the button in the upper right that says slip study, and you can get started and create the report. You can see that there are really just a handful of inputs required. And this was very much on purpose to make this tool very easy to use and to not cost local governments money to do this. This should be a simple task to accomplish that doesn't require a lot of time. And we wanted it to be very accessible and easy to be done. We don't want to create a burden on local governments. Really, we just wanted to provide that information for the person constructing the project. Next slide, please. Once you fill in all the information and hit the Create Report button, you get a report that will look something like this, and it will have narrative as well as graphical information about what your report says. And this is not the final format, of course, we're still working on that, but really we want to give a comprehensive picture of what's going on and what could happen. Notice that in the lower left, you see recommendations. Those are our adaptation suggestions, recommendations, potential options that you could think about doing. You notice this isn't engineering advice. This is general information, and we took some cues from websites like Flood Factor. But how can we portray this information so that it is easy to consume and without creating a mandate, without creating what we didn't have the authority to ask, which was a regulatory mandate. There's lots more I could talk about the slip tool for a long time because I think it's really cool. I will mention one other thing about the rule. We did decide after lots of input from the public that we needed to narrow down what kind of sea level rise projection we wanted people to analyze their project against. And we did decide to use NOAA 2017 intermediate high projection. People can use other projections as well if they want, but that's the minimum that has to be, you have to include that one to fulfill the requirements of the statute and the rule. Next slide, please. And I will say that's a huge deal, by the way. I didn't mention it, but it is a huge deal. And we're very excited to put that out and start making that really public. Last slide I have here has to do with some resilience related legislation. And if I could, I would just put strike through in all of them, except for the top bullet there, Resilient Florida Grant Program, and 1377 and 1379. Everything else related to resilience really didn't get off the ground, but gosh, what we got was amazing. And Resilient Florida Grant Program is going to happen. There is $20 million next year for planning grants, similar to what we've been doing, and which includes vulnerability assessments. There are several other pods, several other aspects to the legislation, including the establishment of the Florida Flood Hub at USF, which hopefully will lead to a much higher level of coordination among all the universities so that we can really get the downscaling that Wendy was talking about earlier done and honed in on. I will leave it there since my time is up. You can go to my last slide, which is very pretty and has my contact information on it. And I'll be happy to hang around for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters, now audience. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We have Erin Deady coming next. Thank you.
Sure. So my presentation is going to be kind of specific about some of the legal and policy issues that local governments are facing. Mostly what I do in my practice as a lawyer and a land planner is work with local governments that are undertaking either integrating resiliency and vulnerability into their comprehensive plans, or they're doing some type of vulnerability assessment. Next slide, please. And so I track out of Columbia Law School this really great database that kind of categorizes the types of climate change litigation that's going on both from a domestic and an international perspective. And while 1,350 cases doesn't seem like a lot of cases within, the nationwide and at the state level in terms of all the litigation that's going on, these cases are really making new law. And it's not that they're within a regulatory context of dealing with regulations related to climate change, but we're using traditional environmental type resource and natural resource claims and theories of the law to kind of advance the ball on carving out new law and policy. Next slide, please. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Whitney did a great job, but my presentation is kind of building on what she's talked about with what DEP is doing, both from a programmatic standpoint and a rulemaking perspective right now. And so these are the main things that are really driving local government response. If it's not that the local government is looking at the technical information and saying this is a good idea, they're doing it because they're receiving grant dollars or there's some type of funding allocation to help spur that discussion, or their comp plan is coming for an update and they want to aggressively or understand from a data and analysis perspective what their vulnerabilities are over time and how they can potentially respond to them and what they might be required to do in their comprehensive plan. Next slide. There's also local law that's being promulgated, and I don't want to forget about that. So we've got case law at the federal and state level. We've got regulations that are evolving, programming that's evolving around climate change, but also local governments are responding. And here are two examples. SEAWALL ordinances and shoreline policy is a really hot topic right now. People are trying to understand how they can help private sector or utilize public seawalls and responding from their assets that they may own to prevent flooding. And so both City of Miami and Broward County are recent examples in terms of seawall regulation. One thing that's a little bit unique about the Broward County seawall ordinance is that they require a disclosure to property owners that they are located in a tidally influenced area, and they may have to undertake work on their seawall to come into compliance with this new local regulation. So, this is another way that local governments are influencing response to climate change and sea level rise. Next slide. And so some of the big legal and policy issues that are kind of swirling around there, we know that state and local governments are undertaking litigation against the fossil fuel industry to pay their share, kind of like a polluter pays theory of paying their share of adaptation response that local and state governments have to undertake because of the impact of the fossil fuel industry on climate change. That's one theory. Another theory is level of service and torts. People that want to see the government respond, or they want to change the way the government is responding to climate change, they may undertake some type of litigation or some type of advocacy work around level of service for flooding. We know that takings is an issue potentially with some local governments. They may be concerned about how a takings claim might play into either encouraging them or discouraging them from undertaking some type of adaptation project. And then we know that there is litigation right now regarding payment structures. Who pays for flood mitigation, especially if people aren't going to receive the same level of service from a flood mitigation perspective throughout a community? How do you apportion those costs appropriately for people to contribute through assessments or user fees to that response? Next slide. And so the bottom line is that there is no real case law right now in the state of Florida related to sea level rise, except for one case related to public trust doctrine, which is ongoing right now, which I will talk about. There have been some attempts at litigation related to some of the Peril of Flood amendments. That has not been successful at this time. But really, what this is about is trying to figure out what local governments' obligations are in terms of their response for climate change, sea level rise, and adaptation. Next slide. And so the basic questions are, does the government have to respond? Does the government legally have to respond to climate change and sea level rise? And what happens if the flooding and the impact is not through a government action? And I'll kind of get into why that's important. Next slide. And so what type of flooding are we talking about? The picture, the Monroe County picture on the left side, basically is showing the effect of tidal flooding. Like, this is through a ROADS elevation project. And what we have conveyed to the community is that the roads can be elevated, but because the property elevations are low, flooding still may occur on the individual property versus precipitation-based flooding or storm-based flooding that is rain coming out of the sky, and that is traditionally managed through a drainage system and through permits. You have a different type of regulatory structure and response related to that type of flooding versus sea level rise or tidally influenced flooding. Next slide. And so the reality check is that there may be people that are unhappy with the local government's response to climate change and sea level rise. They may be trying to force the local government to act through some kind of litigation, or they may be trying to get the local government to contribute to the response where private property flooding is concerned, or they may perceive that there is a taking of their property either through government action in terms of how an adaptation project is designed and permitted and is implemented, or government inaction. You may be accused of taking somebody's property values if you're not acting and you're allowing that flood impact to occur without mitigation. Next slide. And so I'm just going to run through a couple of key concepts that may be interesting to advocates and local governments in particular. People think that local governments have a duty to respond in terms of drainage and flood mitigation, and that's not necessarily the case, particularly with regard, and a lot of my stuff is related to roads and stormwater because that's where the rubber kind of meets the road in terms of an initial priority for sea level rise and flooding response. But a government entity does not have a duty to upgrade roadways to keep up with climate change and sea level rise flooding. It's absolutely permissive, but there's no tort-based duty that government has to evolve its infrastructure to keep up with sea level rise. Next slide. And important to that, is the government immune if they decide to take an action or not to take an action? And so case law is pretty clear that planning level decisions, that type of decision to say, hey, we need to keep up with sea level rise, we need to elevate our roads, we need to put in more drainage, that planning judgmental decision is something that is 100% entirely within the government entity's purview, and they cannot be dinged in terms of sovereign immunity on that type of decision. Next slide. And then finally, what happens if somebody's access to their property is cut off due to tidal flooding? And so the question is, what is the response related to that? And the impact to the individual property owner has to be more specific than that impact to just the general public. And impact does not mean loss of convenience. So if the shortest route to your property is impacted by tidal flooding, does that require the local government to respond and elevate that road? And the response is no. There may be alternative routes to the property, but loss of convenience is not something that would trigger any kind of requirement for local government response. Next slide. And so related to road planning, road adaptation, and stormwater, there are other things that influence those decisions. For instance, the concept of retreat, meaning the local government has decided in a particular neighborhood that they do not want to adopt the roads or elevate the roads. What are the local procedures that the local government has on the books in terms of road abandonment? The one thing that you do not want to do from a case law perspective is keep the responsibility and the ownership of that road and decide, it's too expensive or it's too complicated to elevate that road or adapt it. You need to abandon it. You need to get rid of that responsibility on the books. The Florida Department of Transportation Green Book standards have minimal design criteria for roads. They also have design exceptions. For instance, if the local government wants to go above and beyond what FDOT requires for its minimal standards, it can make a design exception within its code of ordinances to address higher design criteria to deal with tidal flooding and sea level rise. And then finally, you have to get permits for road elevation and drainage projects from the water management districts. Water management districts do not directly regulate sea level rise based flooding. They do regulate precipitation based flooding. And one thing that we know in conversations with water management districts related to road elevation and drainage permits is that they will ask questions about the functionality of the drainage system for that roadway project and how that functionality will be impacted by sea level rise. But they don't regulate the government, the local government's response. So their purview, while it may be perceived that it's limited in terms of application, water management district permitting is absolutely a place, even now with the law on the books, where that balance between the impacts of drainage and tidally influenced flooding will play out. Next slide. And so, I talked a little bit about water quantity. We know water quality is an issue. The state is undertaking uniform statewide stormwater rulemaking right now, a rule that hasn't been updated in decades. And that was directed as part of water quality legislation, which passed last year. And we know that there is an implication related to climate change and sea level rise. So we're waiting to see what that technical advisory committee comes up with to deal with climate change. Whitney has already talked about the slip rule, but for instance, now, if you have a road or a drainage project and you've received a grant of state funds to help implement that project, guess what? That triggers Whitney's slip rule analysis that you'll have to do related to that project. And this was just specific to the Florida Keys and their road elevation projects. We also have to look at jurisdictional boundaries with national parks, marine sanctuaries, and if there are any staging and phasing issues where you may need some type of special use permit from those agencies. Next slide. So the Monroe County vulnerability study for roads is an ongoing project. We had a very large presentation to the County Commission in November, and we are now moving into conceptual design. And what we are doing is focusing on the first wave. It's approximately 25 to 30% of the roads that are going to be vulnerable by 2045. Next slide. And so what we project right now is with that first initial analysis out of 311 countywide road miles, with the initial 25% of the roads to be potentially elevated or some type of adaptation response, we think we can hit almost 50% of the unincorporated county, and a lot of residential units would benefit just with that initial 25% of the roads being elevated. Conceptual costs assume a complete and total rebuild with stormwater components associated with that. The county is looking at approximately $1.8 billion for sea level rise response just for roads and drainage by 2045. Next slide. And so this kind of shows you the amount of roadway segments and subdivisions and miles and residential units that would be benefited by that first wave, or 25% of road elevation projects. Next slide. And so what we've also done is start to put together a policy response and process outlining what the prioritization has been for the roads project. And so where we are, we've identified those first 25% of the road segments, and we are in conceptual design right now. Next slide. And so it doesn't mean that the rest of the 75% of the roads won't be addressed. They just won't be addressed in this phase of the project. And so after we presented back in November to the Board of County Commissioners, we are now moving into engineering concept. What types of designs will work? Some of these roads are very space constrained, so they're not going to have swales and the ability to do traditional percolation of stormwater for quantity and treatment. We may have to use deep well injection or other technologies. And so right now we're trying to figure out what those conceptual designs are to fit a 25-year sea level rise projection. After we have those design concepts and better cost estimate figures, the query becomes whether or not in those particular areas it makes common sense to actually elevate and adapt those roads. Next slide. And so if the answer is yes, if it's pretty clear that a lot of property owners will benefit, that we can get permits, we have a good workable design, then you would go through that green process where the road project would actually be incorporated into the roads implementation plan, to seek funding and for actual construction and elevation of the road and the stormwater components. If the answer is no, for instance, if there's a road, but only very few property owners would benefit from the elevation of that road, like say a road leading off of US 1, it goes through a big open space and it lands, on the Gulf or the Atlantic Ocean, and only a few property owners are benefited, then it may not make sense to reconstruct or rebuild or elevate that road to a 25-year useful life, because just the cost benefit isn't there. And if that's the case, we would go through that red and orange process to determine what level of service might make sense for that particular neighborhood, establish that. For instance, maybe it's not a 25-year standard, maybe it's a 10-year standard for sea level rise. And we would establish that level of service, go through a specific designation, and then the project would be incorporated into the road implementation plan. The whole point of this process is that we're going to have to take this flow chart and we're going to have to reduce this into words to go into the code of ordinances and potentially policies within the comprehensive plan to be transparent about what the county's process is going to be for prioritizing. And this is just one strategy, and it's related to roads and stormwater, but a similar type strategy would probably exist for other components of infrastructure. You have to undertake prioritization and figure out what is going to make sense for the community. You may not be able to afford to do it all, so you may have to establish and use a tool of establishing differing levels of service to be transparent with people about what they're going to get and how the local government is going to respond. Next slide. And so what we've been very clear about is that there are responsibilities for countywide adaptation, roads, county buildings, infrastructure, other partnerships with utility service providers, public sector adaptation. But that does not mean that the county is ignoring the fact that there's going to have to be some type of private property adaptation response also from a policy perspective. Are we going to let people improve their shorelines, and how? Do we want natural shorelines? Obviously, we want to encourage that, but it may not be practicable in every circumstance, especially when you've got a shoreline that may be right in front of critical infrastructure. You may have to do something to harden that shoreline. What are we going to allow people to do with their lots? Fill policy. encouraging people through programs to elevate or mitigate their private structures. So you need both the public sector response and the private sector response to truly achieve a resilient community. Next slide. And so I like to end on this case, Reynolds v. Florida. This is a series of cases, both at the federal and the state level, about trying to effectuate some level of change within the energy delivery policy for the state of Florida. These public trust doctrine cases, the theory of the case is essentially that there are certain resources that need to be held in trust for future generations. And it's somewhat of a novel theory in trying to extend those public trust protections to the atmosphere and the right to a clean and stable atmosphere. What these cases are seeking in terms of remedy is a statewide greenhouse gas inventory and a statewide remedial plan to stabilize the climate system to help protect natural resources and our atmosphere for future generations. Next slide. And that's it. And so I think we are at time. So if you have Q&A, we're good to go.
And we do. Thank you very much to all of our panel 3 presenters. Those were excellent. We're now going to go to the question and answer with our audience. Audience, some of you know the drill, but if you don't, please log into menti.com and enter this 8-digit code. You'll see a screen displayed where you can enter your questions now. And panelists, we're going to turn that over to you. Please feel free to start taking turns responding to as many as you can within the allotted time. They should be coming in here just shortly. Well, while we're waiting, I have a question for all of you. There's been some discussion in Florida about these new rights of nature laws or attempts to provide nature some rights, legal rights. Do you see that in any way interfacing with these laws around climate change and resiliency?
I mean, I'll start and then you guys can jump in the way you see fit. I mean, we've seen these rights of nature type cases in other states and in federal litigation. So it's not illogical to me that that would be something that would, kind of start also within Florida. I think any of these theories are helpful to kind of round out our policy response. And I'll give you an example. There's already litigation in the Florida Keys that's ongoing about the delisting of the Florida Keys mole skink. So these types of cases provide new avenues for the advocacy community to try to get a local government, state or federal government to respond. So I think they're absolutely critical in providing yet another option to try to push forward action, especially on the part of natural resources and species.
Great. And if the rest of you just want to start jumping in, and I see some of these are even directed to specific presenters.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. There's a couple there about the slip tool. I'll go to the more general one first. Will there be efforts to encourage non-government entities to use the slip tool? So the website will be open to the public. The slip tool function will require a secure login, and we're still working on how we will hook up our local government and our state government partners with those secure logins. And we're keeping it that way for a number of reasons. First of all, to have that data be secure and so that it can't be tampered with. But also at this point, new in the tool, we have kind of some space constraints, if you will, some storage constraints. And so hopefully we will build functionality into it so that we can expand it and let other folks, the public can generally do a slip study themselves. But right now, for now, you won't be able to do that without one of these secure logons. So you'll have to be a local government or a state agency to get that secure login. In terms of the critical elevation, if you look in the rule language, there's some flexibility in that. And we did that on purpose, and that's so that you can use the elevation that's critical for your project. And because the tool covers such a humongous breadth of projects, everything from roadways to multi-story buildings, that elevation is going to be unique to the project, or there'll be certain categories of those kinds of elevations. So it might be an elevation associated with a roadway. It might be a finished floor elevation. That's going to vary depending on the kind of project.
I can take a quick one. The status of Reynolds v. the state of Florida. The case is in the First District Court of Appeals. There was a request made for oral argument that was denied. So the pleadings are in front of the DCA right now. And so we'll see when there's a ruling, either regarding the complaint on the merits or whether there's a denial and further litigation.
I can jump in here around some of the federal questions. One question was about what policies would you like to see passed to end climate change? If I were a benevolent dictator, I would impose economy-wide policies that would have mandated emissions reductions. But alas, I have not been able to get that title. And so we're working through Congress, and really that has meant more sectoral policies. I talked about transportation electrification, and we talked about resilience and sustainable agriculture. So it's a bit more of a piecemeal approach that we're taking right now. You also, or somebody else asked about the end of the filibuster. Absolutely, there's interest in trying to end the filibuster, but I'm not convinced that eliminating the filibuster would open the gates for a progressive agenda. You still have to get 50 votes in the United States Senate, even if you eliminate the filibuster, and that includes very moderate and conservative Democrats. And so I think even with the elimination of the filibuster, you still have hurdles in terms of passing legislation there. And one final comment on that, we have seen the political pendulum swinging back and forth. And so the elimination of the filibuster, which may give Democrats an opportunity to advance their goals now, is going to provide that same benefit to Republicans who may want to roll back some climate change policy going forward. So I'll stop there, and we can move on to some other questions.
I wanted to respond to the first one there about the notion of extending SLIP requirements to private sector development. I mean, the requirement now is triggered that if a project receives state funding. But I personally, this is my own theory, I don't know this to be true. I believe that the tool provides benefit to local governments. Now, whether or not local governments require some type of analysis like that as part of their development approval process, that remains to be seen. There may be a lighter touch approach like the state is taking, like this is informational and we'd like to see you undertake this analysis through the development process, but we may not have you be required to actually change it, but hey, this is information that you should be using in the planning process. So I'm actually encouraged and would counsel, my local government clients, why would you reinvent the wheel if this is a good tool for use of the state for the evaluation of these projects, and you're looking at being a little bit more progressive about your climate requirements and sea level rise and how it impacts development approvals? I would say, hey, why not? Why not?
I can talk about what people can do to influence the government to pass climate change initiatives. You know, I would greatly encourage people to reach out to members of Congress, engage them in a dialogue around the impacts that climate change is having. And we need to act now, or these impacts are just going to accelerate. Business leaders can be very influential, state and local leaders. They are those voices that can be very helpful in changing opinions on Capitol Hill. And I guess the bottom line for all of that is to get out and vote, and make your vote demand that candidates and members of Congress take this issue seriously, and that they make commitments to passing policies that reduce emissions and fight climate change. There's also a question here around a clean energy standard, and whether that's the sort of legislation that's more likely to pass than a price on carbon. So it's a great question. A clean energy standard is focused just on the electricity sector, and a price on carbon generally is broader across the whole economy. That's usually the way that we think about those different policies. And I think that where we sit right now, that it's a little bit hard to see either of those really big ideas happening in the short term. But let me say this, a clean energy standard does have some support from the utility sector, as I mentioned earlier, and there's a lot of ongoing dialogue on Capitol Hill about how it might be implemented to benefit environmental justice communities, and otherwise be a policy that could move forward in the current political climate. A price on carbon, in many ways, is simpler. It's easier. It's easier to understand. But it is a tax, and that is a difficult policy to advance through Congress. So challenges on both of those. I would say that right now a clean energy standard is probably easier to move forward, especially given the push that we're getting from the Biden administration. It's something that the president raised in his infrastructure release. There was also a question here about establishing robust nationwide electric grid to take advantage of renewable energy sources. Excellent question. And it's interesting because this is another aspect that has gotten some traction on Capitol Hill around in the infrastructure package. How can we make grid modernization part of advancing our infrastructure, which it absolutely should be. Infrastructure is not just roads and bridges, it's also making sure that we have the building blocks in place to move us towards a clean energy economy. And the grid has to be updated. This is a intersection of lots of different policies. It's state, it's federal, it's funding, but it's also siting, it's also permitting. So there certainly has been a lot of activity around that. And it is something that is on that menu for the infrastructure package. One of the things that's unclear right now is how expansive is the definition of infrastructure going to be when Congress advances a bill, which I'm confident that they will do a bill this year, but how big is it going to be, and how is it going to include something like transmission infrastructure? Is it going to include broadband? Is it going to be more narrowly focused on transportation, roads, and bridges? But absolutely on the agenda, and certainly something that as we bring more renewables online needs to be addressed.
I can take the one on case, I'm going to call it the case study question, like what can we learn? And the answer is, well, I hate to give you the lawyerly response of it depends, but it kind of does in terms of what you're looking at. There are a couple of really good case studies in terms of integrating climate and resiliency into a comp plan. I can give you a great case study is the city of Delray Beach. They updated their comp plan, and not only did they do their Peril of Flood amendments, they took their conservation element of their comprehensive plan and expanded it to be conservation, sustainability, and resiliency. And I know they also dealt with government operations in those comp plan updates, which is not something people typically add into the comp plan. So that's a great case study on comprehensive planning stuff. Broward, they've recently adopted that SEAWALL ordinance. So they've got some interesting shoreline policy. They've done a lot of very good integrated groundwater, surface water work, and they've got a new drainage standard that incorporates future conditions into a map series that you have to account for. Monroe County, I talked about today. Monroe County got kicked out of FEMA's community rating system program because of their downstairs enclosure issues. And they were just recently awarded a 3, which is one of the best class ratings in the state of Florida through a lot of years of work and analysis and building up their data sets. They undertook the expense of collecting mobile LiDAR data. They are in the midst of doing a countywide roads and stormwater planning project right now. The city of Miami Beach has done some interesting stuff with green building and historic buildings and adaptation response. Pinellas County has done some really interesting stuff with infrastructure analysis in the budgetary process. So really, it's just kind of where you're at right now. In terms of what kind of case studies you're looking at, because I like to say there's no right way or wrong way in terms of adaptation response. I would say that it needs to be done comprehensively and holistically and not kind of like the Band-Aid approach of running here and running there. Know what your vulnerabilities are overall so you can respond.
I saw the note asking what resources are available around policy and climate change. Certainly, the Environmental Defense Fund has lots of resources on its website, which is edf.org. You should feel free to check that out. I think that has a range of information that might be of interest.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is that Columbia Law School tracking website, because not only do they track all the different types of litigation, they also have what they're calling their deregulation tracker, which is what we've seen kind of happen over the last administration for rollbacks. And so they've got a lot of really great resources in terms of policy and law also.
I also want to mention on that, we have, it's not strictly related to climate change, but the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook is available on our website. There's a PDF of it on there, but it's pretty big. So if you want a hard copy, I can send that to you. It really helps pull a lot of information together about adaptation planning in Florida. It's the result of a multi-year project that was funded by NOAA over several years, and that was coordinated through DEO. So I do recommend that. I also wanted to, I got a couple of other questions here at the end. Down here at the bottom is the state coordinating with regional climate compact parties. Absolutely we are. We are funding some of them. And if you notice in the new legislation for Resilient Florida, there's more funding available for regional resilience climate compact type organizations, entities. Funding available for them to provide technical assistance to local governments and cross-jurisdictional projects. So that's a huge advance, yay. And then is there any state emphasis on making resources more easily available to EJ communities? I've done several things recently with a focus on environmental justice communities. And I think that's an area where DEP is really ready to step out and make some progress. I know that we're sort of marshaling some resources and understanding about how, what our current level of engagement is, and then thinking about what it could be. In the resilience planning grants and in the Resilient Florida program, you'll see that addressing EJ communities gives you extra points. So if your project is focused on that, you're going to have a more competitive application. So we are encouraging local governments to address that.
I'll
Well,
just,
great. That wraps up about as much time as we have for questions today, but I do encourage all of you out there in the audience who have additional questions to go to the proceedings document, which has abstracts from our presenters as well as their contact information. So feel free to directly communicate back with them if you have additional comments or questions.